which is from sort of 7 o'clock through to 9 o'clock. So we'll go through and look at the patterns on a bird and the names we give for all the different parts, and then how they get colour. Then we'll stop and have a cuppa. And Ben did their shopping this week, and he's renowned for his Tim Tams, so there's a good selection out the back there. And then we'll come back and do the last 2 hours and finish at 9. Right, so what I'd like to talk about today is the main structures on a bird on the outside, and then over the next few weeks we'll look at other bits of them. But to start with, anyone who's ever plucked a chook, you know that the bird isn't covered in feathers all over the body. There are patches where there's no feathers, and those patches under the arms, across the breast, bits of the neck, those parts are pretty consistent, and where the birds do grow feathers in very definite tracts, they use those growth points from which they spread the feathers out to cover the rest of their body. And they can manipulate the feathers, they can raise them, lower them, shift them sideways. So where the shaft comes into the skin, there's little muscles attached, and they can pull and stand the feathers up or move them sideways one way or the other. And those little follicles, they're much like the follicles that we have for the hairs on our skin. And in the same way as we have little muscles attached to those hairs that can stand the hair up, and so we get goosebumps when the muscle pulls tight and you get a little raise of skin because it's pulling the hair and giving it a goosebump. They're using those muscles to raise the feathers so that they can add a layer of insulation, like putting on another coat. And because of that, they're able to add extra layers of insulation, and so they can deal with colder and colder temperatures, and so keep their body temperature the same. And then as it gets hotter, they just flatten the feathers down. They don't have sweat glands like we do, so their way of keeping cool, you'll see a bird on a very hot day, it'll be panting and using the evaporation from its lungs to cool itself down. We're interested in a few particular places that the feathers grow, because we'll look at those a lot more, where they grow along the wing, the front of the wing, and the primaries and secondaries. The tail feathers, where the rectrices grow, those caudal tracts, they're the main ones that we'll be looking at. And then there's the feathers themselves. And you've got a central shaft that grows out, and then you've got a flat blade of the feather. Now, depending on where the feathers positioned on the body, they have different shapes. If you've got air moving down along a feather, or in a way that's not going to come directly from the side, they tend to be quite even, either side of that shaft, or rachis is its technical name, R-A-C-H. And if you've got something like a flight feather, particularly the primaries, the leading edge of the primary feathers, where the wind is hitting them, that has to be shorter to deal with the forces that are being applied to it. So you tend to get a feather, the wind would be coming mostly from this direction, and so it's thinner on one side and longer and flatter on the other, where the feather trails onto the next one, overlaps onto the next one. So they're the two major ones that we see in the tails and in the wings, primary, secondary, tertiary, and the rectrices. Then you've got a bunch of feathers that cover right across the body, and they provide the contours for the whole body. So they tend to be much shorter, right down the back and the front, up into the head. It's just the size of them that varies. And those semi-plume feathers, they're really about weatherproofing, waterproofing, about giving that nice shape that allows the laminar flow of the air over the whole body, and of course the colour for the whole body. Then you've got three very specialised sets of feathers. The filler plumes are found right across the body, and they're positioned in amongst all the other feathers. And their role is, well, first of all, they have nerve endings at the base that detect movement and sense touch and that sort of thing. But they also have a role in holding and positioning the other feathers, the semi-plumes, across the body. They help hold them all in place. And a lot of them are found around the face. And those ones around the face tend not to have those little plumy parts at the end. They tend to be more just spines. And they're positioned around the mouth and across around the eyes. Their role seems to be a number of things. But if you've just grabbed an insect and its wings are flapping everywhere and its legs are flapping around, that set of barbs around your beak and around your eye help to protect from all the things whacking. They also detect sensations of touch and movement, so the little bit of movements that you get. But if you look at something like a willy wagtail or a grey fantail, you'll see a lot of those around the bill and the face. Then you've got little bristle feathers, tend to be very stiff and erect, and they again have strong sensory function, nerves attached to the bottom, and they feel all the movements of air over the body as well as the movement of the feathers. And the final one's the downy feathers, which you see on the young birds, particularly those birds that are born that depend on their parents for quite a while. We have a whole lot of birds that are like that, but there are some young ones that really, they hatch out and they're off. They never see their parents again. We say they're precocial. And things like our malleefowl, they spend many, many days growing and hatching inside that mound, and then they dig their way out and they'll spend 3, 4, 5 hours recovering on the mound, and then they're off and they never come back. They never see their parents again. So that's it, they're gone. And when they hatch out, they are not covered in down, they're covered in a lot of their feathers already. So that down, you get it in the adult birds, particularly waterbirds. They'll have the main body feathers, the semi-plumes, and then they'll have a layer of down underneath those feathers, and that's for warmth. And we use that down for our sleeping bags. And some of it is particularly highly insulating, and the key duck for that is the eider duck, which is in Europe. So you get eider down, and that's where the eider comes from. And for that sort of down, they just take it straight out of the nest. They don't wash it, they don't do anything. It's got feces on it and all sorts of things, and it just goes straight into the sleeping bag because it's the best you can get, and you spend a lot of money on that. And then you can end up with goose down and that sort of thing. It's insulating, but if you want to be sleeping on the top of Mount Everest and survive the night, then you might move to the eider down and spend your fortune on that. So a range of feathers, something like the downy feather, you don't have that central rachis. It's quite weak. It's not stiff and solid. So it's mostly just fluff. And on the major part of the feathers, you don't have a set of structures that hold the feather together, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Then you get specialisations of feathers. So in the birds, the flight feathers, the primary feathers, they have one edge different from the other, but you also get, where they're out, right out in the wind, where the biggest forces are on them, you'll get a lessening of the surface area. And you'll see that in quite a few of the birds as they fly over. And that little movement that margination, is so that the forces don't break that feather as easily. We talked last week about the feathers across the wing and started thinking about the names for all of them. We went from the primaries out, P1 through to P10. In this particular bird, which is a warbler from Africa, a reed warbler, that 10th feather is quite small. And that's vestigial, in the same way that we might have our appendix as vestigial. It doesn't really serve a purpose in its modern presence. It's just a bit of a leftover thing. Although the appendix does have a little bit of a role in a few things, it's not like the cecums that you might have in a koala or something like that, where a lot of the food goes in and is slowly digested over days by bacteria. In us, the appendix is very small, and if we do get things stuck in it, then we're in a little bit of trouble. But other than that, it has a few roles that they've just worked out over the last few years. And that idea of things being vestigial. Then you've got the secondaries, and remember, as the wing gets longer, the number of secondaries increase. So we have generally 10 primaries in pretty much all the birds. And then in this case, in the reed warbler, you've got 6 secondaries. In something like an albatross, you might have 20 or 30. So many, many more to give you that big long wing. Those feathers, the width of the wing compared to the length affects its flight, and I'll talk a lot more about this over the next few weeks. But if you've got a bird that is able to take off and fly virtually vertically straight up in the air, it's got a width versus length ratio that's virtually 1 to 1. And then as you go out to the longer, thinner wings, where you might have 10 to 1 in the ratio, or more with your albatross, those birds struggle to get lift until they get to a certain speed, and then they're off and away. In fact, we have certain migratory birds that come across Australia and will spend 6 months here flying around. They don't land. Some of the swifts, if they do land, some of them are in a lot of trouble because they can't actually take off from the ground. They actually have to land in a tree high up. If they do land on the ground, they have to walk to the tree, climb up the tree physically until they get high enough up, and then they can fall off, accelerate down, and away they go and they can fly again. So you'll see that when they nest, they nest on cliff faces, and they don't build their nests from sticks or anything that would require them landing to collect. They build their nest from saliva, which coagulates and sets. And so those birds, you get bird nest soup made out of those nests. And that's their solution to never really being able to land except on really high things that they can accelerate away and take off.
So they obviously feed in the air?
Yeah, they feed in the air. They pretty much do everything except raise their young in the air. And you know, we didn't see them here, but sorry, up north this morning we were watching martins and swallows, and of course they're drinking on the wing, just running along the top of the water. So they're doing most of their life in the air, and a lot of birds can happily fly and sleep. They switch off one side of the brain and the other side keeps them going and swap over. So some birds have got that really specialised flight. Anyway, back to this one. On the primaries and secondaries, we've got those coverts that are giving us that nice wing shape, that aerofoil shape. The secondary coverts generally get called the greater coverts. And that's about where they sit on the wing when they fold up as well. Primary coverts, you've got the allula, the little bastard's wing. And then above the greater coverts and the primary coverts, or above the greater coverts really, you've got the medial coverts and then the lesser coverts and then the marginal coverts. Little layers of feathers that give that beautiful outline on the wing. Okay, And then finally, the ones that sort of give the connection to the body, they're the tertials that sort of connect the wing to the body and so create that nice smooth flow across
So
the...
the primary and the secondary is signified by the joint in that wing?
Yeah, you missed that last week, sorry. So where the wrist is on the bird, you've got the thumb and a couple of remnant bits of fingers, and the feathers that come out from the carpals down, they're the primaries, and then on your wrist down to your elbow, you've got your secondaries and then your tertials. Okay. And when we look at the feather structure in detail, that's central rachis, and then you've got barbs coming off, and then those barbs have coming off of them little barbules. Those barbules, the ones going back are different from the ones going forward. The ones going forward have little hooks on them. And when a bird is preening itself, it's actually zippering up all those little hooks on the leading side onto the ones of the next barbule so that it holds the feather in a nice, tight, strong structure. The other thing they're doing when they're doing that, you'll see them, they'll put the head around onto the top of their back, just behind the tail feathers. There's a little gland there, a little oil gland, and they'll be collecting oil from that and then running it along the feathers to protect the feathers and keep them healthy, because bacteria are attacking those feathers, sunlight's attacking those feathers, a whole lot of things going on, so that in the end the feathers slowly fall apart.
So that's not anything to do with waterproofing?
It can be, yeah. And it's about keeping that feather healthy as long as it can be kept. So they're using that gland to collect the oils that they spread across the wings and the rest of the body. Okay. And the difference between these feathers and things like the downy feathers is the downy feathers don't have these connections, they don't have this strong central shaft. It's more about a whole lot of barbules in the end just sticking out all over the place, barbs and barbules, but taking up a lot of space so that it traps the air. Then the way feathers grow and the way in which they can be coloured is quite interesting. We'll talk a bit about this, but just to start with, to get you to think about it, the way in which they're coloured, we have names for different types of patterns on the feathers. If you're thinking about a lot of your really cryptic birds, and we happen to see a nice duck today that does this as well, when you get a pattern that really creates a lovely camouflage, that vermiculation where you've got varying waves of pattern across the feather, and then you've got bits where you just get a different colour around the fringe, a different colour on the tip, something like when you see a new starling plumage. They have that beautiful spotting right across their whole body. It looks quite spectacular. And then as the feathers wear out, those little white spots all sort of disappear, and you end up with quite a plain bird, still metallic in its whole colour, but not nearly as spectacular as when it gets its new plumage. So where the colouring turns on the tip, you get colouring down the central shaft that might be different from the outside of the feather. A little band towards the tip. Barring. A lot of feathers get barring because of the growth patterns. And the feathers growing during the day and during the night. And that growth during the night gives you a slightly different tone in the feather. If you hold it up, you'll often see the bars, they're growth bars. If you take day and night, that's one whole day. And then you can count how many days the feather actually took to grow. Other birds do that in a much more definite way with solid colouring in it, and you'll see that more clearly. Subterminal fringe, where you get a little bit of colour around the outside that's different from that band, rose thorns, edge, and so on. Those patterns have names, and that's not so important in and of the feather by itself, but when you look at how they're laid out across the body, where you've got a group of feathers laid out in a row across the body, and they've all got the same pattern on them, then you end up with patterns appearing on the whole bird. Now, if you're thinking about that, that can be really handy in helping you to write down what you're seeing or identify what you're seeing. So this streaking of the breast here, we didn't get to see it very well today. We had a singing honeyeater briefly, but lots of streaking down the breast. If you go back and think about that bit of colour along the shaft, if you have that across a whole bunch of feathers as you work down the body, you end up with streaking right down the body. So each individual feather, central shaft, has a different colour. It might be black or whatever, and so you end up with that streaking right down through the breast onto the belly. If it happens to be a blotch on the feather, then you end up with a spotted appearance. If there happen to be little bands, they might be subterminal bands, or they might be some sort of barring that runs across the feather, chevron, then you end up with a pattern that's running right across the bird's breast that gives you that barred effect. And so on it goes, blotched and then mottled and scaled or scalloped. And you'll see all those patterns in birds as we move around. So be aware of that and think about what the individual feathers are doing, remembering that you've got feathers overlapping each other as you go across, and just the little patterns on each one is giving an effect. If we look at some birds that we'll see around Australia, looking at the grass wrens, you can think about the central shaft being white, and so you get a pattern right through it, and the brown on the outside of the feather. And then here we've got this individual feathers. Remember, these are the primaries and secondaries through here, and then these are the ones sitting on top of them on the wing. So when the wing folds up, these are the feathers that were sitting above the coverts. And so central part of the feather is black, and then there's a fringe of white. And so on we go down. You can picture what is happening with those feathers, a little terminal band, and so on we go. Other feathers, parts of them one colour, parts another. Then for some birds it's about the whole feather having one colour but setting them up in patterns across the body. And so on we go. Thinking about which feathers have which patterns will help you to identify them. Okay, now a little bit of physics quickly. Colour and how we perceive it, and then something that you really need to think about, birds see it totally differently. So if we're seeing a bright yellow bird, that doesn't mean a bird is seeing a bright yellow bird. So we'll talk about a few things, but so we're all talking the same language. We've got the electromagnetic spectrum, which is all the different types of energy that can be transmitted, and part of that is light, and we see that moving through the air. There's a whole lot of things moving through the air that we don't see them. They don't have to be moving through the air, they can be moving through space. Everything from gamma rays, which have really high energy and can go straight through us and down through the earth and keep going, through to X-rays, which lower energy again, but can get through most of our body, bones a little bit harder, down to ultraviolet rays, which can get through our skin and damage the cells underneath. And then there's a particular part of the spectrum that we can actually see, a very small part. And then we go to things like infrared. We can feel infrared, we feel it as heat. And so on down through radar, FM and short waves and AM, that sort of stuff. So waves that are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And these are nearly a kilometre long waves, very, very long waves, through to 10 to the minus 18 of a metre. So very, very small. The waves themselves, they're an electrical wave, and then perpendicular to them is a magnetic wave. And that's why we call it electromagnetic. And because they have two directions, we can talk about them being polarised. If we have normal light, it's a mixture of all different sorts of orientations. But if it's bouncing off water, some of them don't get to bounce, they get absorbed. Only a certain orientation will bounce off, and so you'll get all the light having a particular orientation. And if we look at that, we don't see it any different, but we can get glasses that filter out light of a particular orientation. So we can filter out all the light that's come off the water like that and let that sort of light through. So we remove all the glare from a water surface with our polarised glasses. So polarised light is where most of the light is all set up in one orientation. It's not a mixture of everything. The bit that we're interested in at the moment is everything from blue through to red. And do you remember your old way of remembering it? Roy G. Biv? That mnemonic? So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, colours of the rainbow. We have the ability to detect three colours of light. We have three different types of receptors in our eyes, our retinas. And so when we see colour, it depends on which receptors we're getting light into. If we're just getting the red one receiving light, then we see red. And if we're just getting the blue one, then we see blue. And if we get both, then we start to see other colours. And the artists use that with your colour palette. You start mixing your colours up. You start with your three basics and then mix them all up from there. It gets a bit tricky with birds because they see four. They have four types of receptors. They actually see up into the ultraviolet. So we don't see it, the ultraviolet. If we're getting a combination of red and blue, then we start to see one particular colour. But they might also be seeing ultraviolet. And we're not seeing ultraviolet coming off from that. So what we call a purple or whatever, they might actually be seeing as something totally different. Okay, so just to remind you, the length of the waves that we see as red light, they're about 700 nanometres. And a nanometre is a billionth of a metre, 10 to the minus 9. So the waves in that are relatively long compared to the ones that we see as blue and purple. They're about 400 nanometres. And you'll see why that's important in a minute. And they're closer together, 400 nanometres from peak to peak. And these ones are 700 nanometres from peak to peak. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Okay? And we call that the hue. Okay. Have you ever seen this wheel before? The Munsell wheel. If you're an artist, it's something you play with a lot. You've got your primary colours. So what are your primary colours? Red, yellow, and blue. So here they are here, red, yellow, and blue. Okay? And then we take our primary colours and we start mixing them, and we get the other colours in between. So as we go around the wheel, we're mixing the primary colours to make these other ones. If we're taking yellow and blue, if we get them in about equal amounts, then we get green. Remember all that from your art? Okay. Then, so that gives us what we call a hue. Then we can start playing with how much white or black is in the colour. Okay? And that gives us our brightness. So if we put a lot of white into a red, it fades off and fades off. We're spreading out the distance between the dots of red. And so it gets lighter and lighter and lighter. And then we can go through to very dark versions of that. The final way we can manipulate the colour is the intensity of the colour. So we can have really concentrated yellow, and then we can change the intensity as we move down towards the centre. Okay, that's really what a good artist is doing. They're playing with all those three things. They're playing with the hue, red, yellow, green, blue. They're playing with the saturation, and they're playing with the brightness. Okay, and that gives us all our colours that we can see as a human. But if we want to do it like a bird, we've got to add another dimension, because we've got ultraviolet in there as well. So we can mix ultraviolet with yellow. We can mix ultraviolet with red. We can mix ultraviolet with blue. And so we get a far more complex view of the world. And so when we go out in our camouflage, thinking we're hard to see, if there's a lot of ultraviolet coming off it, then the bird is going to see us far more differently than what we think we're seeing. They're seeing us like. So it's not the world that we think it is for the bird. And if you're a scientist, you have to rejig your whole brain and start looking at ultraviolet coming off and allowing for that as well. So we can actually shine light onto a feather, and we can shine red onto it and see if it comes off. And then we can go right through the spectrum, orange, yellow, blue, up to ultraviolet. And we can look at where the peaks of light reflecting back off it are. And do you remember what white is? White is a combination of the red, the yellow, and the blue. And if you take your red light, if you take a red light, shine it on the wall, and take a yellow light, shine it on the wall, and take a blue light and shine it on the wall, where they all overlap, you see white. That means all the colours are bouncing back off it. So if I'm looking at that white wall there, those panels, that's because my eyes are seeing all three detectors in my eyes are getting a colour bouncing back to them. So if I get all three detectors side by side stimulated at the same time, then there's red wavelengths coming in and blue are coming in, and so my brain is working out that that's white. That's what my brain is saying to create that white. And if I'm getting black, why is it black? There isn't anything coming back. It's all being absorbed by that paper. So that paper is actually getting hotter because of all the light hitting it and staying there. The energy is being trapped there. Just be aware of that. It's interesting to think about. The next thing is, how do the birds colour their feathers? And there's three major ways they do it. The first way is using a group of molecules called melanins. And there's two types of melanins. The eumelanins, which are black, basically, and if I have them spread out a little bit, they become grey, and the less dense I make all the dots, the whiter they become. And then there's phemomelanins, which produce those chestnutty, yellowishy, rufusy sort of colours that you see in a lot of our birds. Now, the interesting part about these melanins is where you get them in a feather they make the feathers stronger. So a lot of birds have them in these outer primaries. You'll see them in our gulls, and all sorts of birds just have black in the outer primaries. And so they can put energy into making those melanins and putting them into those feathers that they need to be strong. If I've got my wing and I fold it up, those primaries, the outer ones are the ones that might get brushed as I move through the bush, but the inner secondaries, they're all covered up and protected, so I don't need to waste a lot of energy putting melanins into my secondaries. They're protected. The primaries are the ones sticking out in the wind. They need to be strong out there. Whereas the ones back here, the secondaries, they've just got air flowing over them rather than across them. And so they don't need to be as strong. So a bird, when it's making melanins, it can actually make it inside the cell. It's got the DNA that can make the enzymes that make melanins. And so it can lay it down in the feathers wherever it wants. And so when you see the black and the whites, or these browns and whites and blacks and whites, that's melanins. And the birds can make those fit into any feathers when they want. The part that's really neat is, when you look at the reds and the yellows, they can't make those in their body. In order to get red or yellow into a feather, they have to eat it. Okay? Yeah. And flamingo's pink because of the little crustaceans it eats, and it gets the colouring from them. With these reds and yellows, they're carotenoids, in the same way that we eat carrots. A bird has to actually eat all of the red it wants to put into its feathers. It eats it, goes into the digestive tract, gets absorbed into the blood, and then taken to the cells and laid down in the feathers. But they can't decide to add a little bit extra unless they eat it. And that creates an interesting scenario. If I'm growing a feather and I want my feather to be really, really red, then I have to eat lots of food that have that red in it. If I want it to have yellow in it, then I've got to eat food that has yellow in it when the feather's growing. And in ecology and biology, that's really neat. We call that an honest indicator. If I want to look really, really spectacular, the only way I can do it with reds and yellows is to be a really efficient forager, to be really good at what I do. And the female birds use that as an honest indicator. If they're out to select the male that's going to give them the best food source for their young chick, then they look for the brightest colours. And we can manipulate that, and sure enough, the males that have the brightest colours, they get the ladies. So that way of understanding how they eat and how they fill out those feathers is quite interesting. If you want orange, then you put down yellow dots and red dots next to each other, and so you get that orange in between, in the feathers. Okay.
But surely they're not eating red and then yellow.
Well, they have to eat the berries or whatever it is that they require to get those colours, yep. If they're not getting their carrots...
Doing it all at once. Like, there might be red and yellow flowers all at the same time.
So in that day or those few weeks when they're growing those feathers, yeah, they have to get their mix right.
So they don't get mixed up.
No, and you'll see a lot of the red, yellow birds do vary a lot. Your orange chat can be everything from yellow through to orangey, and that can give you an understanding of the variation that you might expect to get.
Especially in arid lands
when there might not be food, and in our arid birds have special challenges. They might go 2, 3, 4 years until they get conditions where they can breathe. So the way they grow feathers varies a lot out there. They grow feathers, they molt in a different way from other birds. They tend to molt in a way that they'll molt number 1, they'll molt number 4, they'll molt number 7 and number 10, and then they'll grow that and start on 2, 5, 8, and so work through. And then if good conditions come, they just stop molt and start to breed. Whereas the other birds, they'll be molting right through their feather all at once. So they'll have dropped 1 and be growing it, 2 and be growing that, and 3 and be growing that, and 4 will be out. And so you'll see quite a step in the wing where these 4 feathers are all growing at once. And it's not so easy to suddenly stop there because you've got an impact on your flight. And some birds, they molt all at once. So they're flightless for 3 or 4 weeks. And a lot of ducks do that. They will head off and disappear in the deeper veg around the lake or something, and they'll drop all their feathers at once and come out with new ones. So there's a complexity going on with the molting.
The budgie yellows would only grow feathers at some times of the year.
Budgies I'm not sure about, but I'd expect that, yes. Given that the budgies are doing what they're doing, they're highly explosive in the way they breed. One thing about the yellows and oranges and reds, a bird either makes a feather yellow, or orange, or all red. It doesn't have the ability to put patterns in it because the cells, it's putting the colours from its diet straight into the feathers. It can't get the cells individually making little spots and other ones not. So those scallopy patterns and all that sort of stuff we looked at before, they can't do that as well. They use an all or nothing approach with the yellows, oranges and reds.
What happens if you starve them of their colour? What happens to them?
They can't produce it.
So therefore a red robin would come out a grey robin or something.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
With that, with like the not being able to put yellow in their wings, I'm pretty sure the, what are they called, the Port Lincoln parrots, some of the feathers I've got of theirs, they've got purple and green.
We'll talk about purple. So purple's a bit different again. So that's the third type of coloration. So we've had the melanins, which give you the black, whites and browns, sort of. And then we've got the carotenoids, which are the yellow, oranges and reds. And then you've got something which is about physical coloration. And that's a bit more complex. And this is particularly for the blues. And to explain how it works, there's a neat little example with this Stella jay, which is a North American bird. If you look at cross sections of the feathers under microscopes, you get layers of melanin in the feathers. That's that layer there. So this is the top of the feather going down through the feather. So if you can imagine it lying flat on the table, and we're looking down through the feather at a cross section. Okay, we've got a layer of melanin there. And then there's a layer of collagen above it. And then there's a skin layer. And we're all trying to keep our collagen healthy in our skin, so we've got collagen there as well. Now, if I've got white light coming onto this feather, the collagen causes the blue light to reflect. So it hits the feather and bounces back like a mirror. But because the wavelength of these other two are longer, they get to go past the collagen. They go straight through and they hit the melanin, and the melanin's black. And what's it do to those colours? It absorbs them. So they don't bounce back. If all three colours bounced back, we'd be seeing white. But because these two get absorbed, we see the blue of the blue jay. Now, if you've got an albino form of that bird, it doesn't have melanin. It doesn't have that melanin layer. So it doesn't absorb the colours when they go through the collagen. It hits lower down in the feather and those other colours bounce back. If you've got the red bouncing back, and if you've got the green and the blue all bouncing back, what do we see? We see white, which is why you get a white bird.
I saw a white whale on Facebook last week.
Okay, same thing. All the colours hitting it are bouncing back. So that lack of melanin, which is just a genetic bolt, they can't make melanin, so they can't put it into their feathers. That lack of melanin means they turn out white, not because of something that's about how the light is the colours within the feathers, but because of how it bounces back. So this is like a mirror, it's bouncing all the light back. Or it's like a white piece of paper, that's a better analogy. This one, some of the colours are being absorbed. Okay? Now that's structural coloration. It's not about the colours that are sitting inside the feathers, it's about how the light bounces off. Can you see the difference? And that leads to two different types of colouring. But just to explain, remember before I said the wavelength of red light was long and the wavelength of blue light was relatively shorter? So 400 nanometers versus 700. Well, if you can picture a collagen fibre, if the light hitting the little molecule of collagen, if the wavelength is smaller than the size of the molecule, then it bounces off. That's a property of light. If the wavelength is bigger than the size of the molecule, it goes straight past. So, we said before that the greens and the reds were going straight through until they hit the melanins. That's because the collagen fibre is the size it is. So this only works for the short wavelengths, the blue, the B, the indigo, and the violet and the ultraviolet. Those shorter wavelengths are all going to reflect back off, and the bird's going to see those. The longer wavelengths, the Roy and the G part of the spectrum, red, orange, yellow and green, they're going to head on straight through. And then there's another thing that I need to explain just very quickly. You know when you're out at sea and two waves, two peaks meet each other, what happens? If you've got two wakes that come across each other, what happens where the wakes meet? If the trough meets the peak, they wipe each other out. If the peak meets the peak, it goes up, it's double. So if you've got two waves this side and the peak meets the peak, suddenly the wave is this size. If you've got two troughs this deep and suddenly a trough meets a trough, then they add. And so if you're off a really rocky shoreline and a wave's coming in and bouncing off, you can have a 1 metre wave coming in and then a 1 metre wave bouncing off, and where the peaks meet the troughs, you've got nothing, but where the peaks meet the peaks, suddenly you've got a 2 metre wave and the troughs, and so you if you're on a kayak, you're up and down all over the place, or a boat. It gets very rough where those cross waves meet each other. So where a peak meets a peak, they add. Where a trough meets a trough, they subtract. And so you get bigger waves, doubling in their size. If you've got a peak meeting a trough, they cancel each other out. If you've got a trough meeting a peak, they cancel each other out. So where you've got exactly the same waves travelling in opposite directions, you can actually have nothing. Which sort of defies the brain, but that's what's going on. With colour in birds, that's really important. If you've got waves reflecting off and two peaks are meeting in the wave, then you see a really bright colour. If you've got waves reflecting off and they're just out of sync and a peak's meeting a trough in the light, then you won't see anything at all. It's black. There's no wave. And that leads to the next type of colour, which is this structural coloration. So, there's two types of this. One is like we saw with the top-notch, with the crested pigeon tonight. You get that metallic colouring in the feathers. and it looks black at one angle, and as they turn around, suddenly you get that burst of metallic colours. And then there's this other type. Now these are structural colours. They're not because of blue in the feather. That feather isn't blue. It's because the light hitting the feather, some of it's being absorbed, the reds and the greens, and some of it is being reflected back off, okay, which gives you the blue.
Just going back a step.
Yep.
Isn't our perception of colour exactly that? So blue is only reflecting the blue spectrum of light.
Yep.
It's not a blue thing. It reflects blue.
That's right. But
And so the blue feather just reflects blue light.
yes, but if you've got, but that's because of the physical nature of what's going on.
Yeah.
But if you've got red colouring in the feather, then the other colours are being absorbed and the red is being reflected off.
But colour is...
Yes, it's what's
reflects,
coming back off. But some of it's caused by the chemicals that are sitting in the feather, and some of it's just by the structure of the feather.
Okay.
Yeah, is that...
Yeah, right.
So it does blow the brain a bit.
If you cut the feather out of that bird tonight, it'll be a different colour.
No,
It'll be the colour you see it as, but it just depends on the angles, and I'll explain that one in a sec. So with this non-iridescent colour, no matter what angle the bird's on, you just see it as blue. But with some birds, and this is a neat series of photos that I couldn't do, like this is a structural colour on the feathers. Notice that part of the throat is black, but the part of the throat that's black here is actually coloured here. So as the bird turns around, the angle at which the light is hitting changes. Okay. This is colour that's dependent on the angle, and it's about the oil layer on the feathers as well. You've got light coming in, some's getting absorbed, the greens and the reds, and some's bouncing off. At a particular angle, the waves add, and we see really intense colour. As we go past that angle, the troughs of the waves are lining up with the peaks of the waves coming out, and the waves cancel each other out, and so we see black. So as the bird turns around, we're getting a change of how the light's interacting. Where it's adding together, we're getting brighter colours, and where it's cancelling each other out, we're getting black. And that's the last way, the common way that you get colours. Then there's a few lots of different things within some groups. So parrots do things a bit differently. But be aware and think about it as you see your different birds around. Your melanins, so going back to the start, the blacks where you've got melanin laid down in the feathers, the white where there's none, so all the colours are bouncing off. The browns where the melanin's laid down in the feathers, but it's a different type of melanin, pheomelanin versus that eumelanin. Okay, then you've got the carotenoids, which are giving you the oranges, reds and yellows, and these are ones that only come into the feathers because of what the bird eats. So they're dependent on how good they are at finding their food. I should say, most birds, it's the males that have the colour. But the really colourful female birds, where the male is plain, they're interesting ones because typically it's the female who's selecting a male, laying eggs. Sorry, it's the male who's selecting a female. The female lays the eggs. The female moves on and the male stays and hatches the eggs. The female then goes on and another partner is found. And they lay eggs again. The male stays and looks after those eggs. So where you've got the female is the one that moves on and leaves the male behind, they have to attract the male, and they're the colourful ones. And so the indicators become important for them. We'll talk about a few Australian birds that do that. And then the third type of colouring is that structural coloration, which is about how the waves interact with each other. And you have two types of that. One is the non-iridescent, and the other one's the iridescent. And look, there's lots and lots of good books on all this, and it's quite complex, and that's simple in a way, but it's worth reading about.
It seems the most colourful are forest birds that live in the forest, or not?
A lot of them are, yeah, passerines in particular, but not.
Well, I was thinking the bird of paradise.
Yeah, yeah, a lot of them.
Exquisite colours.
They do, and they can switch them on and off and do off. They can change and jump in and out of light and do a whole lot of neat things. Once you start getting into it, it's quite a feast of understanding. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but this sheet that I've given you has got all of these different parts of the bird outlined. We're going to spend the next 9 weeks using these sheets a fair bit, learning the names and thinking about the feathers and how they line up. So think about the primaries, and when a bird folds up its wing, where they end up, and the secondaries and the tertials and the greater coverts and the medial coverts and the lesser coverts. So how the wing affects what you see on a bird. And then some birds do really nasty things, like a lot of shorebirds, and they fold up their wing. They relax all these feathers on the back here and let them fall down over the wing. So when you think you're looking at the wing, you're not. You're actually looking at the feathers that have fallen down. And those feathers through the middle of the back, from the rump, up into the back, up into the mantle, up into the nape of the neck. We'll refer to those at various times. The tail feathers, most birds have 12. Some, like the ducks, have more, particularly diving ducks. And then some, like pelicans, have a lot more again, up into 20s and 30s. But typically there's about 12 tail feathers, called rectrices. And then there's the coverts on the tail feathers, upper and lower coverts. And where you get nice contrast, you often have tail feathers one colour and the coverts another. So that can be lower coverts or upper coverts. The flank, the belly, something like the whistlers telling one female from another. It's about whether there's a bit of colour in the belly or not. Up into the breast, and then the throat. The gape of a bird can often help you. When a young chick is in the nest and it's begging for food with that big open mouth, the gape is usually yellow or orange, or white sometimes, but very, very strongly coloured. And you'll be looking at a bird through the binos and you'll see a colourful gape, and at the same time you're looking at all this weird plumage and you have no idea what it is. But the first signal for you to think, it's probably not an adult, is you see the colourful gape. So it's left the nest, it's still got the colourful gape, and so that's a little alert for you to know. Then around the head, you've got a whole range of structures that become really important, particularly in the small birds. So if we're telling different fairy wrens apart, we'll be looking at the colour of the lores, or we'll be looking at the colour of the supercilium, the feathers that run through like an eyebrow. And then the ear coverts, the ear of the bird's hidden in there, and so on. So each of the parts of the bird, we'll be slowly learning those over the next few weeks. The legs, this tarsus here, if you think that leg is the same as our leg, the angles are a bit funny. So where the ankle is on a bird is up here. Okay, then you come up to the knee and then up to the... Okay, so the ankle of the bird, that bone there is called the tarsus. That's one that's in our foot. It's below the ankle. That'll do. Just quickly to get you thinking, the primaries, when that wing concertina is up, folds up, think of how those feathers all lie on top of each other and where they end up. So they're the primaries through here. If a bird's got a really long wing, if the wing is coming out here, those primaries are necessarily much longer, and so you'll get a step right back to the tail. And then there might, if the wing is long and thin, you'll have long primaries down to here, and then the secondaries don't start till up here. And you'll see that step up. And that, for some North American birds, that's the only way you tell them apart, where the secondaries end relative to the primaries. The secondaries sitting straight above them. The tertials. What's a very small part of the wing becomes a very large part of what you see when the bird's sitting still. And then the coverts of the secondaries, the greater coverts, they're a major part of what you see in the wing. Some birds, you need to look just at that to be able to tell them apart. And then you've got the median coverts, which are sitting straight above them, again. And finally, everyone can see, you've got the lesser coverts, which are right up the top there, on the wrist of the bird. That's the wrist. It's sitting up here. Okay, and the feathers are coming back down off it. So there's the wrist of the bird. The elbow's tucked down in there. And then all the other birds you see, it's just a variation on the theme. You've stretched some bits here, you've made other bits shorter there. So here the primaries, this is a migratory wader, here the primaries are longer than the tail feathers. And that might be one feature that you're looking at to help you identify the bird. Are the primaries shorter than the tail feathers or longer? Which is telling you something about the wing length. Tertials, secondaries, so on. But same sort of thing, just slightly skewed. If you're a dressmaker, you understand the concept, okay? You've got to cover the same bird, typically the same number of feathers, you just apply it in a slightly different way. Looking at the head, there's a whole lot of structures that get names, and sometimes telling birds apart, that's what you've got to look for. Some of the ones that you might want to think about, the cere, that's that bit of colourful skin that you see on top of a beak, particularly in the raptors and budgies, yep. And that's usually got the nostrils in it. There's the law that we talked about before. Some of those bristles, the particular long thin feathers that are sitting out around the beak. Any guess where the spur comes from in the spur-winged plover? Lula, yeah, it's a thumb with a solid spur on it instead of feathers. And if ever you've been clipped on the head by one of them as a kid, you know that they really can do damage.
They don't have any toxin, do they?
No.
No.
Isn't that good? I doubt I'd be here if they did. Okay. The feet of the birds, the way they're organised, if you get to see them, that can be really useful. Particularly dead birds on the beach and that sort of thing. So whether they've got all 4 toes pointing forward and webbed, or whether it's 3 toes forward and 1 back and webbed again, or something like the parrots, biodactyl feet with 2 toes forward, 2 back. You see them grab onto a perch. through to something like a grebe, where instead of having webbing, they've just got those flattened toes with folds of skin going out sideways. Okay, sorry about that, but that's a quick run through, and there's all sorts of things that you can go into detail there, but it just gets you thinking about the types of structures you need to be looking at, and if you're aware of them, then you will start to see them when you look at a bird, and that will help you to identify them as we go on. Questions?
We're not being tested on this, are we?
We can if you want. Okay, but just it'll slowly, you'll use some of these words more and more as we go through the 10 weeks. And keep that sheet handy, which is why I suggest that some of you get a plastic book of inserts, just so you can bring that along every week and have it in front of you. And every now and then just have a look at it and think about it, because it really does get useful after a while. You begin to see a bird in a different way. You don't just see that rough outline, you start to see all the structures.
You can Google all this stuff, can't you?
Some of it you can, some of it you can't. Yep, there is a really good site. There's a university in America that specialises in a whole lot of bird ecology, and they have a lot of good stuff that you can follow up on. There's also a University of New England, I think, that does a diploma in avian ecology, and you know, if you really love this sort of stuff, you can go and do a diploma if that goes on. And I know people who've gone on and ended up getting quite involved into research through that sort of thing. We'll stop there. Grab yourself a bite to eat, Tim Tams, hot water, and just watch this as you come through.